This isn't a story about a man who needed a cook and found a wife. That's a fairy tale for people who have never felt the gnawing emptiness of a house that's just a structure, not a home. This is a story about a man who had built his life on being invisible, on the idea that needing someone was a weakness to be stamped out like a prairie fire. It's about the day he looked up from the ledger of his lonely existence and saw a woman walk through his door, not with a smile or a sparkle, but with a broken spirit that mirrored his own. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have prepared for, was that in her silent grief, he would find the answer to a question he was too afraid to ask: how to feel alive again. This is about the slow, terrifying, and beautiful unraveling of a man who was looking for a cook and found his soul instead. The dust is in my blood. It's in the creases of my hands, in the back of my throat, in the quiet creak of my bones when I rise before the sun. Some men are born to the ocean, some to the mountains, but me, I was born to this flat, endless expanse of Texas dirt, a land so big it makes a man feel both insignificant and, in the same breath, the sole master of all he can see. For 46 years, I'd been the master of nothing but my own solitude. My name is Silas, and I own the Double R Ranch. I inherited it from my father, who inherited it from his. It was my legacy, my prison, and my only true companion. For the last 2 years, since my wife Martha passed from a sickness that came on swift and cruel, the silence had gotten so loud it was a physical pain. It echoed in the empty kitchen, in the cold sheets of my bed, in the whistle of the wind through the long-abandoned garden she used to tend. The ranch hands were good men, quiet and hardworking, but they were transient. They ate their fill, did their work, and retreated to the bunkhouse. The big house, the one my grandfather built with his own hands, felt like a mausoleum. I was the ghost haunting its halls. I wasn't a man given to wallowing. My father, a man of few words and even fewer emotions, had taught me that a man's feelings were a private matter, best kept buried deep where the sun couldn't find them. "Tend to the cattle, Silas," he'd say, his voice like gravel. "Tend to the land. The rest is just noise." So I worked. I worked from the moment the first gray light touched the horizon until my back ached and my eyes burned. I worked to fill the emptiness, but it was like trying to fill an ocean with a thimble. The sorry state of the meals was the first thing to crack my carefully constructed facade of stoicism. I could rope a steer, fix a fence, and break a horse, but I couldn't boil water without burning it. The ranch hands had been surviving on my burnt coffee, lumpy beans, and tough, leathery beef for far too long. I could see the pity in their eyes, the silent jokes they'd share with a glance. I was a grown man, the boss of a 1,000-acre spread, and I couldn't manage a simple stew. It was a final, humiliating insult to my sense of self-reliance. That morning I sat at the long oak table in the dining room. The late morning sun streamed through the dusty window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In front of me was a cold, congealed plate of eggs I'd scrambled into a yellow, rubbery mess. The bacon was blackened carbon. My coffee was so bitter it could strip paint. I stared at it, a monument to my failure, and for the first time in years I felt something akin to self-pity. It was a bitter, acidic taste in my mouth, far worse than the coffee. I pushed the plate away with a frustrated grunt, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. I knew what I had to do, but the very thought of it made me feel a fresh wave of shame. I needed help. I needed a cook. The advertisement had been sitting on my desk for a week, a simple, typed piece of paper I'd drafted and redrafted a dozen times. It was a plea, dressed up as a professional inquiry. I grabbed my worn Stetson from the peg by the door, the familiar scent of leather and sweat a small comfort. The ride into town was a dusty, 40-minute affair. The sun, a relentless white-hot coin in a pale blue sky, beat down on my back as I guided my horse, Scout, along the familiar dirt road. The land here was a patchwork of dry scrub, mesquite, and cactus, punctuated by the occasional, starkly beautiful cottonwood tree. It was a landscape that demanded resilience. It had no patience for weakness. I hitched Scout outside the general store, its wooden facade weathered and gray. The bell above the door jangled as I pushed it open. The interior was a cool, dark haven from the sun, smelling of dried leather, coffee beans, and the faint, sweet scent of molasses. "Morning, Silas," drawled the storekeeper, a rotund man named Frank with a handlebar mustache and an easy smile. "Frank," I nodded, my voice rusty from disuse. He was already pulling a stack of flyers from behind the counter, a knowing look in his eyes. "Here you go. Put 'em up at the Mercantile and the saloon. The little one by the station, too." I cleared my throat, the sound thick and awkward. "Appreciate it." I took the stack of advertisements from him. I'd written them myself. Ranch cook wanted. Good food, fair wages. Room and board provided. Inquire at the Double R Ranch, Silas McAllister. It was the barest of bones, offering no warmth, no welcome. It was as cold and impersonal as I had become. I felt a strange, hollow sensation as I thumbtacked the first one onto the corkboard near the door. It was an admission of defeat, a public declaration of my brokenness. I'd rather have wrestled a wild bull into a pen than ask for a stranger to enter my home. The days that followed were an exercise in waiting. I'd catch myself looking towards the long, winding dirt track that led to the ranch, half expecting, half dreading to see a rider approaching. Each gust of wind that carried the sound of hooves would make my heart lurch, and then sink when it was just one of the hands or a stray steer. I was a man waiting for his fate, and I hated it. A week passed, then two. My cooking remained a disaster, and the hands' patience was wearing thin, their mumbled complaints getting louder. I was beginning to think that not even a desperate soul would answer the call of a man who couldn't even make his advertisement sound inviting. I imagined them reading it, envisioning a dark, inhospitable place, a master who was just as cold as the food they'd be forced to eat. And they'd be right. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, a week and a half after I'd put up the first flyer, that I heard the sound of a buggy struggling up the lane. It was a slow, laborious sound, completely at odds with the quick, confident rhythm of a mounted horse. I was on the porch, mending a broken bridle, the leather dry and stiff in my hands. The sound made me stop, the needle suspended in midair. I squinted down the dusty lane. A lone figure was approaching, seated in a small, weather-beaten buckboard pulled by a single, tired-looking mule. It was a woman. Even from a distance, the silhouette was unmistakably feminine, though slumped and weary. My first instinct was a jolt of irritation. I'd asked for a cook, not a charity case. I could tell just from the way the mule was plodding that this was a person carrying a heavy weight, a burden too big for a single horse and a single person. She stopped the buckboard a few feet from the porch, the mule heaving a sigh of exhaustion. The woman sat for a moment, staring ahead at the house. She looked worn, frayed at the edges. She wore a high-collared, dark dress of plain, serviceable wool, dusty from the road. A simple black bonnet framed her face, and her hands, resting in her lap, were encased in worn black gloves. I stood up slowly, the bridle forgot. My heart, which I'd been so sure was dead, gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. It wasn't attraction, it wasn't even curiosity. It was something more primal. It was a recognition. I saw in her stillness the same bone-deep exhaustion that I carried in my own soul. I saw a woman who had been worn down by something, a loss so profound it had stolen her life. She was the mirror image of my grief, a stranger who was heartbreakingly familiar. "Help you, ma'am?" I asked, my voice coming out gruff and suspicious. It was a defense mechanism, the only one I had left. She finally turned her head to look at me, and I felt a jolt. Her eyes were the most startling shade of pale blue, like the winter sky, but they were utterly bereft of light. They were a void, a pool of unshed tears that had long since dried up. The skin around them was bruised with fatigue. There was no smile, no hint of warmth, just a weary, clinical assessment. "I saw your notice at the Mercantile, Mr. McAllister," she said. Her voice was soft, but it had a strange, flat quality to it, like a piano with dead strings. "You're looking for a cook." It was a statement, not a question. "Woman's work," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. It was a thoughtless, automatic cruelty born from my own discomfort. I was trying to put her off, to protect myself from whatever this feeling was. Her eyes flickered, and for a fraction of a second I saw a flash of something else beneath the surface. Hurt, anger, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same deadened calm. "It is," she agreed, her voice unchanged. "I can cook. I need a place to stay." I felt a sharp pang of guilt. Here was a woman who had clearly fallen on hard times, and I was treating her like an intruder. "I'm looking for someone who knows their way around a kitchen," I amended, my voice softer. "I do," she nodded slowly. "My name is Rebecca, Rebecca Blackwood. I was married to a man named Jacob. He worked the timber over in the piney woods near the Sabine River." I knew what was coming. I'd seen that look in the mirror too many times. I prompted, the question gentle despite myself. "He died," she said, and the words were so devoid of emotion it was terrifying. "6 months ago, a tree fell on him. There was nothing to be done." She said it like she was talking about the weather, but I saw the way her gloved fingers tightened on the reins. "I lost the cabin. I've been staying with his sister, but she's got her own family. I'm not. I'm just in the way." I looked at her then, truly looked. I saw the fine lines around her mouth that hadn't been there a few years ago, etched by grief rather than age. I saw the way her shoulders were permanently hunched, as if she was still bracing for a blow that had already fallen. I saw a woman who had been so thoroughly broken that she was just going through the motions of survival. And I saw myself. The silence stretched between us, filled with the buzzing of flies and the creak of the old house settling. My mind was a battlefield. Every instinct I had screamed at me to send her away. She was a complication. She was a reminder of the life I'd lost, of the woman I'd let go of. Having her here would be a constant, painful echo of Martha. But another voice, a quiet, long-neglected voice, whispered that this was something else. This was a chance, not for love, God no, but for salvation, of a sort. To bring some semblance of life back to the house. To fix the ache in my gut that wasn't about burnt bacon or lumpy beans. "It's a long ride," I said, my voice rough. "And the work is hard. You'll be cooking for 4 men besides myself. The bunkhouse is separate." She met my gaze then, her pale blue eyes holding mine with a surprising steadiness. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. McAllister. I'm afraid of nothing at all." Her words were a cold, clear bell in the quiet air. They hung there between us, a statement of her reality and an unspoken challenge. I had been afraid of nothing for 2 years. I'd been hiding in the void, in the silence, in the hard work. And here she was, a stranger, holding a mirror up to my soul. I had a choice to make. I could retreat into my fortress of solitude, or I could open the gate and let the unknown in. I cleared my throat, the sound loud and unnatural. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if I was saving her or damning us both. But I knew I couldn't let her leave. "The kitchen is through the front door, first door on the left," I said, gesturing towards the house. "If you can make something edible out of what's in the pantry, I'll show you to a room." A flicker of something, relief, uncertainty, crossed her features before the mask of neutrality settled back into place. "Thank you, Mr. McAllister," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She climbed down from the buggy, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were in pain. She was thinner than I'd realized, almost gaunt. She reached for a single, worn carpetbag from the back of the buckboard. She had no trunks, no boxes, no possessions. Just a bag that looked like it held the remnants of a life. She walked past me, her head held high, and went into my house without another word. I stood on the porch, watching the door swing shut behind her. The silence that followed felt different. It was no longer just empty, it was expectant. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence before a storm. I felt a tremor of something deep in my chest, something I couldn't name. It was the end of my isolation. It was the beginning of something terrifying and unknown. I had just let a ghost into my house, and I had the sinking, horrifying feeling that my own ghost was about to meet hers. He was looking for a ranch cook, not love. Then a widow walked through his door. The first thing I noticed was the change in the air. The old house seemed to hold its breath, the dust motes in the sunbeams suddenly still, as if waiting for a signal. Rebecca, or Mrs. Blackwood as I still called her, had barely made a sound since she'd walked into my home. She'd put her single bag in the small room off the kitchen, a space that had been meant for a servant 100 years ago and had served as a storage closet for the last decade. I heard the creak of the bed springs as she sat on it, then nothing, just the profound, heavy quiet. I retreated to the barn, the only place I felt I had any control. I busied myself with brushing down Scout, the rhythmic motion calming my frayed nerves. I was a fool. What was I thinking, inviting a complete stranger, a grieving widow, into my home, my sanctuary? My father's voice echoed in my head. A man who can't stand on his own is no man at all, Silas. Well, I'd just proven I couldn't. I'd practically begged for help, and now I was paying the price, tethered to a stranger's sorrow. Lunchtime came and went. There was a cold, empty feeling in the house, and I was too apprehensive to venture inside. I ate a cold biscuit from the previous day in the barn loft, feeling like a coward. What was she doing in there? Was she just sitting in the dark? Was she going through my things? The intrusive thoughts, the ones born of suspicion and fear, began to claw at me. The first sign that something had shifted came in the late afternoon. I was in the corral trying to gentle a new Mustang that had an attitude as fierce as the sun when a scent drifted across the yard on the breeze. I stopped. It was the smell of onions and beef, slow cooking with herbs. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of Martha's kitchen. My throat tightened. I stood there frozen, the Mustang forgot, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Dusk was settling, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. I finally walked into the house, my boots heavy on the wooden floor. The first thing I saw was the table in the dining room. It was set. Not the haphazard arrangement of plates I was used to, but a proper setting. A clean white cloth, a placemat, a single lit candle in a simple pewter holder. A pot of something steaming, the source of that wonderful smell, sat in the middle, and a basket of fresh, golden brown bread was next to it. Rebecca was standing by the stove, her back to me. She had taken off her bonnet, and her hair, a soft, subdued brown streaked with a touch of gray, was pulled back in a simple bun. She was wearing a clean, if worn, apron over her dark dress. I stood in the doorway, feeling like I was trespassing in someone else's life. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt alive. She turned, sensing my presence. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her soft voice holding no emotion. "I took the liberty of using what you had in the pantry and the smokehouse. The stew should be ready. I made bread." I stared at her, then at the table, then back at her. "It's fine," I managed, my voice a croak. "It looks fine." "Would you like to eat?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it hung in the air between us. It was an invitation to participate, to be a part of this small, domestic ritual that I had abandoned for so long. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I pulled out my usual chair at the head of the table and sat down, feeling like a guest in my own home. She ladled the stew into a bowl. The beef was tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked, the broth rich and savory. It was the best thing I'd tasted in 2 years. I ate it in hungry, silent gulps, my eyes glued to the bowl. The bread was soft and warm, melting in my mouth. She sat across from me, her own bowl untouched, her hands clasped in her lap, just watching me eat. I finally slowed down, the heat of the stew chasing away the cold that had settled in my bones. "You don't have to wait for me," I said, gesturing to her bowl. "Eat." "My husband used to say the food tastes better if I let him have the first bite," she said, a ghost of a memory flickering in her eyes. It was a foolish, old-fashioned tradition. There was a faint, almost imperceptible softening in her voice. It was the first thing she'd said that wasn't strictly functional. "He was a lucky man," I heard myself say. The words were out before I could stop them. I wasn't trying to be gallant. It was just a simple, honest observation. A man who had a woman who could cook like this was indeed fortunate. She looked at me then, her pale blue eyes meeting mine for a moment. The corners of her mouth twitched, not a smile, but a flicker of something that might have been bemusement. "He was a good man," she said quietly. "He just had some foolish ideas." She picked up her spoon and began to eat, her movements slow and careful. I finished my stew and sopped up the last of the gravy with a piece of the bread. The silence between us was no longer hostile. It was simply present. It was filled with the clink of spoons, the crackling of the fire in the stove, and the quiet hum of a house that was, for the first time in a long time, not completely empty. Over the next few days, a routine began to form. It was a tentative, wordless arrangement. I'd leave for the barn at dawn and return for meals. She was always there, busy in the kitchen, keeping the house spotless. She did more than cook. She made the beds with crisp hospital corners that I'd never seen my wife use. She swept the floors and scrubbed the counters until they gleamed. She even, to my astonishment, mended a torn shirt I'd left draped over a chair. The tiny, precise stitches a testament to her care. I began to watch her. It was a compulsion I couldn't control. I'd find myself looking up from my ledger in the study, listening to the quiet clatter of her in the kitchen. I'd watch her from the porch as she hung laundry on the line, her movements economical and efficient. She never hummed. She never sang. She never laughed. There was a profound, profound sadness in her every action. It was a weight that pulled her down, making even the simple act of hanging a sheet look like a chore of immense difficulty. One evening I came in from the corral, covered in dust and sweat. The kitchen was quiet. I was about to go upstairs, assuming she'd retired early, when I heard a sound. It was so faint I almost missed it. It was a soft, choked sound, like a sob caught in a throat. I froze, my hand on the banister. I followed the sound to the kitchen doorway. She was standing at the sink, her back to me. Her shoulders were shaking silently. She had her hands braced on the edge of the basin, her head bowed. There was a single beautiful blue and white china plate on the draining board. It was Martha's favorite, the one I'd kept hidden away for 2 years, unable to look at it, unwilling to throw it away. I'd forgotten it was in the pantry. She was holding a small, floral-painted saucer that went with the plate, her knuckles white. She was crying. Not the loud, sobbing grief of a new widow, but the quiet, desperate tears of someone who has been holding in their pain for so long that it has simply overflowed. It was the most heartbreaking sound I'd ever heard. I saw her wipe at her face with her apron, the gesture one of frustration and shame. I knew I should retreat. I should go back to my room, pretend I hadn't seen anything. That's what a man did. A man gave a woman her privacy, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, a silent witness to her grief. My own carefully walled-off sorrow rose up in my chest, a familiar ache. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. She must have sensed me there. "I didn't mean to, I was just—" She gestured at the plate, unable to finish. I took a step into the room. "It was my wife's," I said, my voice gravelly. "Martha's. She loved that pattern, said it reminded her of the sky after a summer rain." I hadn't said her name aloud in months. It felt strange on my tongue, like a stone I'd swallowed long ago. Rebecca turned to look at me. Her face was blotchy, her nose red, her eyes swimming with tears. The mask of composure was gone. I saw the raw, bleeding wound that lay beneath. "She had good taste," she said, her voice thick with tears. "Keep it," I said. "Please, it should be used. It shouldn't just sit in the dark." She looked at me, her expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. She held the saucer close to her chest, like a child holding a doll. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry for the outburst. It caught me off guard. I haven't had a pretty thing in my hands for so long." Jacob, he was a practical man. He didn't see the point in such things. For the first time I saw a crack in the wall of her stoicism that wasn't just about loss. There was a tiredness, a resignation about her marriage. It made me think that her grief wasn't just for a man, but for a life she'd never truly lived. It was a look I recognized in myself. I had loved Martha, but she had been a quiet, dutiful woman, a partner in the work of the ranch, not a source of passion or laughter. My grief had been for the loss of my routine, my partner. Her grief seemed so much deeper, a yearning for something she'd never even had. I walked over to the table and pulled out a chair. "Sit," I said, gesturing for her to do the same. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I couldn't leave her to cry alone in the dark. She hesitated, then moved to the table, sliding into the chair opposite me. She put the saucer on the table between us, a fragile, beautiful symbol of connection. The first few months after Martha died, I began, forcing the words out, I couldn't even stand to be in this room. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I just worked. I was in a waking dream, or a nightmare, I'm not sure which. She listened, her eyes fixed on her hands. It's like being hollow, she whispered. I feel like a shell of a person. I go through the motions, but nothing is real. The world is gray, and I'm just waiting for it to be over. I know, I said, and I realized I meant it. Her words were my own. I know that feeling. It's the worst kind of loneliness. It's a loneliness that follows you even when you're not alone. I took a deep breath. I don't know if it ever goes away. I'm beginning to think it doesn't, but I do know that having someone else around it makes the silence less deafening. She looked up at me, her pale blue eyes wet with tears. Is that why you put up the advertisement? Because you were lonely? The question was sharp, cutting right to the heart of the matter. I'd convinced myself it was for the food, but as I looked into her tear-stained face, I knew it was a lie. Yes, I said, the admission a relief and a terror. I was looking for a cook, I continued, my voice barely above a whisper, but I think I was just looking for someone to hear the silence with me. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a small, defiant gesture. Thank you, Silas, she said. It was the first time she'd used my first name. It felt strange and intimate, a breach of the careful distance we'd kept. For being honest. That night I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the quiet of two people, each carrying their own heavy burden, trying to find a way to share the load. I didn't know if I could ever love again. The very idea was preposterous. But for the first time in 2 years, I felt a thread of something other than grief. It was a fragile, trembling thing, but it was there. It was hope, and it was terrifying. He was looking for a ranch cook, not love. Then a widow walked through his door. The spring brought with it a new kind of restlessness. The land, so barren and brown just weeks before, was now a carpet of wildflowers and new grass, a vibrant, almost gaudy green under the brilliant blue sky. The herds were calving, the air was filled with the bleating of newborns and the lowing of protective mothers. It was a season of birth, of renewal, of life. And yet in the house a storm was brewing, not in the sky, but in the quiet, unspoken space between two grieving souls. Mrs. Blackwood, Rebecca, I had to force myself to think of her as Rebecca, had become an essential part of the ranch. The men who had initially been wary of her quietness and her sadness now spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones. Best biscuits I ever had, boss, one of them, a young hand named Pete, had said, his mouth full. That woman can cook like an angel. The house, too, had been transformed. It was clean and orderly, and the smell of baking bread was a constant, comforting presence. It was no longer a place of mourning. It was a place of survival. But the survival was a fragile thing. Our relationship had moved beyond the simple transactions of employer and employee. We were partners in a daily ritual of unspoken grief. We'd sit across from each other at the dining table, sharing meals in a comfortable, wordless silence. We'd pass each other on the porch, a nod of acknowledgement, a shared glance that said more than any words could. She started leaving a small vase of wildflowers on the table, a splash of color against the dark wood. I'd started repairing little things around the house that she'd mentioned were broken. It was a silent conversation, a dance of two people too wounded to speak. And the unsaid thing, the elephant in the room that grew bigger with each passing day, was the nature of what was growing between us. Was it just a partnership of convenience, a mutual need for solace, or was it something more? I was terrified to find out. Then the telegram came. It was a hot, still afternoon. I was in the study going over the books when a writer brought the telegram from town. It was marked urgent. I opened it with a sinking feeling in my gut, a premonition of trouble. It was from a banker in a town called Palmetto, deep in the piney woods of East Texas. It was addressed to my attention, but it was for Rebecca. The message was brief, cold, and devastating. Mrs. Rebecca Blackwood, your husband, Jacob Blackwood, had debts. His assets, including the land and cabin, have been sold to cover them. Your presence and signature are required to finalize the transfer. You are instructed to come to our office within the week. Signed, Mitchell and Sons, bankers. The note had been forwarded to me because she had no fixed address. The banker, sensing a weak link, had used the bill of lading from the train to track her to this area. I read the words and a cold fury washed over me. Her husband's death hadn't been the only tragedy. He'd left her with nothing but debt. He'd left her to navigate the cruel, impersonal machinations of a world that had no time for grief. He had not only died on her, he had died and made her life a hell. The resentment I felt for this dead man, this Jacob Blackwood, was overwhelming. I knew I had to tell her. The selfish part of me wanted to hide the telegram, to pretend it had never arrived. The thought of her leaving, of this fragile peace being shattered, was like a physical blow. But I couldn't. I couldn't be that man. I wasn't her savior and I wasn't her keeper. She was a woman who'd been stripped of her agency, and I wouldn't be the one to take even more from her. I found her in the garden behind the house. It was my father's old plot, overgrown and neglected. But she had been working on it, her fingers stained with soil, coaxing life from the barren earth. She was on her knees, pulling weeds from around a small tomato plant she'd managed to get started. Her hair was escaping from its bun, and a smudge of dirt was on her cheek. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment there was a glimmer of something in her eyes. It might have been pleasure at seeing me. "Silas," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "is something wrong?" I didn't answer. I just held out the telegram. She stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her skirt. She took the yellow paper from my hand and read it. I watched the life drain from her face. The glimmer of warmth I'd seen vanished, replaced by that familiar, deadened look. Her shoulders sagged as if someone had cut the strings that held her up. "Ah," she said, her voice a hollow echo, "so they found me." I felt a desperate protective urge. "You don't have to go back," I said, the words tumbling out. "You can stay here. You have a job, a place. You're safe here." She shook her head slowly, not looking at me. "You don't understand, Silas. This is the law. This is how it is. Jacob, he was a good man, but he wasn't a prudent one. He kept borrowing against the land, believing he'd hit it rich with a new timber contract. He never did. He died leaving me with a mountain of paper." Her face crumpled for a second, a flash of pure anguish. "His sister said I had to go to Palmetto. She said there was no point in fighting. I thought if I just left, if I just disappeared, they'd forget about me." "Then let them forget," I said, my voice gruff. "You're a good woman, Rebecca. You don't deserve this." "Deserve has nothing to do with it," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. It was the first time I'd heard any real anger from her. "Don't you see? I'm an anchor around Jacob's memory. I'm the last living reminder of his failure. They want me to come and sign a piece of paper that says I'm no longer a Blackwood, that I don't have a claim on his life, that I'm nothing." She was trembling. "I can't do it," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't go back there. I can't sit in that office and listen to them talk about my husband like he was a bad investment. I can't sign my name and accept that I have no home, no future, no nothing. I'd rather just disappear." Her words were a mirror to my own fears, to the years I'd spent trying to disappear into the work of the ranch. She was telling me she had nothing to fight for, no reason to go on. The realization struck me like a physical blow. I had a reason now. It was her. Her quiet resilience, her broken spirit, her tiny victories in the garden and the kitchen. She had given me a reason to get out of bed in the morning, and I'd been too much of a coward to admit it. I'd let her do the same for herself, all while pretending she was just a hired hand. "Then don't," I said, the words firm and certain. "Don't go back. There's nothing for you there but more pain, but you can't just disappear, Rebecca. That's the coward's way out. And you're not a coward, I've seen it, I've watched you. You're the bravest person I know." She looked at me, her pale blue eyes wide and glistening. "Brave," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. I'm a coward. I ran away. I hid from my own life. You survived, I said, taking a step closer to her. You survived the death of your husband. You survived the loss of your home. And you came here to a stranger's house and you made a life for yourself. That's not cowardice. That's resilience. That's strength. The tears were now flowing freely down her cheeks, but she wasn't hiding them. She was standing there, letting me see her grief, her fear, her anger. I was just existing, Sailors, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. I was just waiting to die. I reached out, my hand trembling, and I brushed the tear from her cheek. The gesture was so small, so intimate, it felt like a violation. But I couldn't stop myself. The dam I'd built around my own heart had finally broken. Me too, I said, my voice a hoarse confession. I was just waiting. And then you walked through my door and I realized I didn't want to wait anymore. I wanted to live. I wanted to be alive with someone else. Not for them, for me. Her breath hitched. She didn't pull away from my touch. She just stared at me, her eyes searching my face. Silas, she started, but she couldn't finish. The words were too big, too terrifying. I know I'm not Jacob, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I'm an old, broken-down rancher who can't even cook an egg. I'm not a good man. I've been a coward. I've been hiding from the world, but I want to be brave, Rebecca. I want to be brave for you. I want to help you fight. Not because I owe you something. Not because you're a good cook. But because you make me feel like the silence isn't so heavy anymore. She was crying openly now, her face streaked with tears. I saw the same conflict in her eyes that I felt in my own heart. The desperate, overwhelming desire for connection warring with the paralyzing fear of being hurt again. We were two wounded animals, circling each other, afraid to trust, afraid to hope. I don't want to be alone anymore, she finally whispered, the words a plea. Neither do I said. That's all I'm asking. Let's not be alone together. She didn't answer me with words. She simply took a step forward, closing the distance between us, and rested her head against my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close. It was a desperate embrace, a clinging, a promise. We were two broken people, clinging to each other in the middle of a storm. I couldn't promise her a happy ending. I couldn't promise to slay her dragons, but I could promise her that she wouldn't have to face the battle alone. And for a woman who had been fighting in the dark for so long, that was all she needed to hear. The storm that had been brewing between us broke that afternoon in the garden. It was not a beautiful release, but a messy, terrifying, and necessary one. It was the first step out of the darkness and into the unknown. I didn't know what the future held, or how we would deal with the bankers from Palmetto. But in that moment, with her in my arms, the world didn't seem so empty. He was looking for a ranch cook, not love. Then a widow walked through his door. The next few days were a blur of frantic, terrified action. The respite we'd found in each other's arms was a fragile bubble, and the cold, hard reality of the telegram was a pin waiting to pop it. We had a week. I'd never been one for grand gestures or sweeping solutions. My whole life was built on measured steps and practical decisions. But this situation demanded something more. It demanded a fight. I spent the first day holed up in my study, my ledgers spread out before me, the numbers swimming in my tired eyes. I went over the books of the Double R a dozen times. There was money, yes, but not a fortune. I had enough to keep the ranch running for another year, but not enough to pay off a dead man's debts. The thought was bitter and humiliating. I was a man who had built his life on the land, and now I couldn't even use that land to save the woman I was beginning to realize I loved. Love. The word itself felt foreign and uncomfortable, but that's what it was. It wasn't a young man's passion. It was a quiet, desperate, bone-deep feeling that had grown out of shared grief and a profound need for companionship. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in my life. She saw the gruff exterior, the silences, the raw wounds, and she didn't run away. She saw the man who had been hiding, and she was the only person in the world who knew he was there. On the third day, she found me in the barn, staring blankly at a harness I'd been trying to mend for an hour. "You're worrying yourself into an early grave, Silas," she said, her voice soft but firm. I sighed, tossing the leather aside. We don't have enough, I confessed, the words bitter on my tongue. The ranch is doing well, but we're not wealthy. I can't pay off a debt that size, especially one I didn't create. I didn't ask you to, she said, moving to stand in front of me. I never asked you for anything, Silas. I know you didn't, but I want to. I want to help you. She shook her head. This isn't your fight. I was foolish to think I could run from it. I'll go to Palmetto. I'll sign the papers. I'll do what they ask. The thought of her walking into that lion's den alone filled me with a cold dread. No, I said, my voice harsher than I intended. I can't let you do that. You go there alone, they'll eat you alive. They'll make you feel like a criminal for being married to a man who tried to better himself. That's their power, Rebecca. They make you feel small. They make you feel like you deserve nothing, and you deserve everything. The fire in my words surprised even me. I saw a flicker of the same fire in her eyes. What do you propose we do then? She asked. We can't fight a bank. They have lawyers, they have the law, they have the money. We have, what? A garden and a mule. The absurdity of it made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. We have each other, I said, the words simple and true. And right now that has to be enough. I'm going with you to Palmetto. We'll go together. They can't take you apart if I'm standing right beside you. She opened her mouth to argue, to protest, to let her pride get in the way, but I stopped her by placing my hand on her arm. I'm not asking for your permission, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. This is what I want. This is my choice. Don't take that away from me. She looked at me for a long, silent moment. Then slowly, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. You're a stubborn old mule, Silas McAllister, she whispered. And you're a woman who thinks she's a ghost, I replied. I'm going to prove you wrong. The journey to Palmetto was long and arduous. 2 days of hard riding, first by wagon, then by train. She sat across from me on the rail car, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mask of controlled anxiety. The familiar landscape of the plains gave way to the dense, humid forests of East Texas, the towering pines creating a green, closed-in world that felt suffocating. The Palmetto Bank was a grand, imposing building of red brick and white stone. It sat on the town square, a monument to the power of capital. We entered together, a quiet, determined pair. The clerk, a young man with slick-back hair and a disdainful look, took our names and asked us to wait. We sat in the plush, dark waiting room, the scent of money and old wood thick in the air. Her hand found mine, squeezing it so tightly I could feel her pulse beating in her palm. It will be all right, I whispered, not even believing it myself. We were ushered into the office of the head banker, a man named Elias Mitchell. He was a large, imposing figure with a booming voice and a handshake that was designed to crush your bones. He looked at Rebecca like she was a piece of furniture he was ready to repossess. Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for coming, he said, his voice dripping with insincere courtesy. You understand this is a very difficult time for the bank. Your late husband, Jacob, was ambitious. His debts, well, they are significant. We've been forced to sell the assets at a loss. We require your signature on these documents to finalize the sale. He slid a stack of papers across the mahogany desk. Rebecca stared at them, her fingers frozen. I could see her lips moving slightly, reading the cold, legal jargon that was about to rob her of the last vestiges of her past. Hold on, I said, my voice louder and more confident than I felt. Before we sign anything, I have a few questions. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. And you are? I stood up and introduced myself, my voice steady. I'm a friend of Mrs. Blackwood's. I'm here to make sure she's treated fairly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was my personal ledger. Now these debts, they were incurred by Mr. Blackwood for the purpose of expanding his business. Is that correct? Mitchell nodded slowly, his eyes wary. Yes, but the business failed. The assets were not enough to cover the debt. But the debt was never personally taken on by Mrs. Blackwood, I countered, pointing to the documents. I've had this looked at by a lawyer in Austin. He says that in the state of Texas, a man's debts are his own unless they are specifically for necessities. These were business loans. They were for timber for equipment. They were not for food or shelter for his family. This debt is not hers. I could feel Rebecca's eyes on me, wide with surprise. She had no idea I'd done this. I hadn't even told her. It was a bluff, a desperate last stand, but it was all I had. The banker's face grew red. That's a very fine legal point, Mr. McAllister, but she is still the executor of his estate. She must sign the documents to hand over the property. But she doesn't have to sign anything to accept his debt, I pressed, my pulse pounding in my ears. You can take the land. You've already done that. You can take whatever the law allows, but you can't force her to accept a debt that legally isn't hers. You're hoping she'll sign out of guilt or fear and make it her problem. But that's not the law, Mr. Mitchell. That's bullying. A tense silence filled the room. Mitchell's face was a thundercloud, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't expect to be challenged by a dusty rancher in a worn-out suit. He expected a weeping, defeated widow. He wasn't prepared for a fight. Rebecca, seeing this, found her voice. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice clear and steady, "what my husband owed you was business. It was not my business. I came here to finalize the sale of his assets, which I understand I must do. I will sign the documents that sell the land as the executor, but I will not sign a personal guarantee for his debt." Mitchell stared at her, his jaw tight. He looked at me, then back at her. He knew he was beaten. He could spend time and money taking a widow to court, but it would be a PR nightmare and a legal quagmire. He had the land and he could sell it. He had been hopping for a quick, easy settlement. He wasn't going to get it. He grumbled, made a few threatening noises, but ultimately he had no choice. Rebecca signed only the papers that transferred the deed of the cabin and the land. She did not sign a single promissory note. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The price was that she walked away with nothing, but she walked away free. The journey home was different. The train rattling through the pine forests no longer felt suffocating. It felt like escape. She sat beside me and she wasn't crying. She was watching the world go by, a quiet, stunned expression on her face. "Where did you learn to do that?" she finally asked, her voice hushed with awe. "I didn't learn it," I admitted, a little embarrassed. "I just couldn't stand the thought of them doing that to you. I knew it was a gamble. I just hoped my guess was right." She turned to look at me, her pale blue eyes shining. "You did that for me," she said, the words a simple, profound statement. "You stood up to a bank, you lied to a lawyer, you did all of that for me." I cleared my throat, feeling like a clumsy schoolboy. "I did it for us," I said. "They were going to take you away from me, and I couldn't let that happen." She reached over and took my hand in hers. "When we get back," she said softly, "I don't want to be the cook anymore." I looked at her, my heart in my throat. "What do you want to be?" She met my gaze, her eyes holding a new light, a new hope. "I want to be your partner, Silas, in everything. I want to help you run this ranch. I want to build a life with you. I can't promise it will be easy. I can't promise the sadness will just go away. But I can promise you I'll be there, every single day." I lifted her hand to my lips and kissed it, a gesture I hadn't made in a lifetime. "That's all I ever wanted, Rebecca," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Just you, just us." The ranch was the same when we returned. The dust, the cattle, the endless sky, but I saw it differently. It was no longer a prison of solitude. It was a home, a place where two ghosts had found a new life. The silence that had once been so crushing was now comfortable, filled with the quiet sounds of our shared existence. I didn't know if we would be happy. I didn't know if the ghosts of our pasts would ever truly leave us. But as I watched her walk into the house, her step a little lighter, her head a little higher, I knew one thing for certain. I had been looking for a ranch cook, and I had found a reason to live. And in the end, that was all a man could really ask for. I took off my hat, ran a hand through my hair, and followed her inside. The smell of baking bread was waiting for me. And for the first time in a very long time, the future didn't seem so empty. It seemed filled with possibility. And with her,